The morning sun caught the edge of Private First Class Robert Hansen's signal mirror at precisely 09:15 hours on June 27, 1944, in the dense hedgerows 3 kilometers south of Saint-Lô, France. The flash lasted less than 2 seconds. By nightfall, 33 German soldiers would be dead. An entire Wehrmacht infantry company would cease to exist as a fighting unit, and Hansen would spend the rest of his life wondering if that single moment of carelessness made him a hero or a fool. He hadn't meant to signal anyone. The mirror, standard issue in every reconnaissance scout's kit, had simply caught the light as he adjusted his position in the shallow observation post he'd scraped into the Norman soil. Just a brief reflection, no different from sunlight glinting off a helmet or a canteen. But in the brutal mathematics of warfare, the difference between invisibility and detection could be measured in the width of a mirror's flash. What Hansen didn't know, what he couldn't have known from his position in that hedgerow, was that his accidental signal had been observed by a German forward observer stationed in the stone tower of a farmhouse 800 meters to the southeast. And that observer, Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann, had spent the previous 6 weeks watching American reconnaissance patterns with the methodical patience of a man who understood that survival in Normandy depended on knowing where the enemy was looking. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The hedgerows of Normandy in late June of 1944 were not the pastoral countryside that peacetime postcards suggested. The bocage, as the French called it, was a medieval agricultural landscape of small fields, divided by earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, some of which had grown undisturbed for centuries. These walls, often 6 to 12 feet high and equally thick, created a maze of natural fortifications that turned every field into a potential killing zone and every lane into a death trap. For the American forces pushing inland from the beaches of Operation Overlord, the bocage represented a tactical nightmare that no amount of training in England had prepared them for. The pre-invasion intelligence had noted the hedgerows, certainly, but had failed to communicate their true defensive potential. What looked like farmland from aerial reconnaissance photographs was, at ground level, a defender's paradise. The German Wehrmacht, having occupied this region since 1940, had 4 years to understand and exploit every tactical advantage the terrain offered. Private Hansen was a reconnaissance scout with the 2nd Battalion, 329th Infantry Regiment, 83rd Infantry Division. The 83rd, nicknamed the Thunderbolt Division for the distinctive patch its soldiers wore, had landed on Omaha Beach on June 18th, 10 days after D-Day, and had immediately been thrown into the grinding warfare of the hedgerow country. The division's mission was to push south and west, clearing German positions and creating the conditions for a breakout from the Normandy beachhead. Reconnaissance scouts like Hansen occupied a peculiar position in the infantry hierarchy. They were neither frontline assault troops nor rear echelon support personnel. Their job was to move ahead of the main force, identify enemy positions, map defensive layouts, and return with actionable intelligence. It required a specific temperament, cautious enough to avoid detection, brave enough to operate alone or in pairs deep in enemy territory, and observant enough to distinguish between an abandoned farmhouse and one concealing a machine gun nest. Hansen had been trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the infantry school maintained an elaborate program for reconnaissance specialists. The training emphasized land navigation, camouflage techniques, silent movement, and the use of optical equipment for observation. Students learned to read terrain, to identify military equipment at distance, to estimate unit sizes from tracks and debris, and to communicate findings through a variety of methods, including radio, runner, and visual signals. The signal mirror, officially designated as the M1 signal mirror, was a critical piece of equipment in this communication arsenal. Circular, roughly 3 inches in diameter, the mirror featured a small sighting hole in its center and was designed to reflect sunlight over distances of up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. The technique was simple. Hold the mirror close to your face, sight through the hole at your target, then adjust the angle until the reflected sunlight illuminated the desired recipient. By rapidly covering and uncovering the mirror, an operator could transmit Morse code or pre-arranged signals. The mirrors were intended for situations where radio silence was necessary or equipment had failed. They were silent, required no batteries, and could transmit over greater distances than hand signals or even colored smoke. But they had one profound disadvantage. They were impossible to aim with perfect precision, and any reflection, even an accidental one, could be seen by unintended observers. This was the contradiction at the heart of Hansen's training. The instructors at Fort Benning had drilled into every reconnaissance student the absolute necessity of maintaining a low profile. "You are eyes, not fists." His primary instructor, a sergeant first class named Morrison who'd served in North Africa, had repeated constantly. "The moment the enemy knows you're watching, you've failed. Dead scouts collect no intelligence." Yet these same instructors had issued equipment that could, under certain conditions, announce a scout's position to anyone with eyes and a basic understanding of light. The manual solution was straightforward. Only use the mirror when necessary, keep it covered when not in use, and be constantly aware of sun position relative to potential enemy observers. In practice, with adrenaline, fatigue, and the chaos of combat, such precautions became suggestions rather than absolutes. Hansen had been in his observation post for 300 hours, inserted under cover of darkness along with his partner, Private George Kellerman. Their mission was to observe a crossroads approximately 1 kilometer south of their position, a junction that intelligence suggested the Germans were using as a supply route for units defending Saint-Lô. The crossroads itself was unremarkable, 2 narrow farm lanes intersecting at a stone marker that had probably stood there since before Napoleon. But its tactical value lay in what it connected. The eastern lane led to Saint-Lô, the western to a series of German positions in the village of Le Mesnil-Vigo, and the north-south route provided access to rear area supply dumps. For 6 hours, Hansen and Kellerman had watched. They'd observed a 3-vehicle convoy pass through, heading east at 0430, logged the movement of what appeared to be a motorcycle courier at 0615, and noted the regular patrol pattern of a 2-man German security element that crossed the junction every 90 minutes. Standard reconnaissance work. Observe, record, report. The observation post itself was a testament to hasty fieldcraft. The 2 Americans had scraped out a shallow depression in the earth at the base of a hedgerow, using their entrenching tools to create a space just large enough for 2 men lying prone. They'd camouflaged the position with cut vegetation and positioned themselves so they could observe through gaps in the hedge growth without silhouetting themselves against the sky. Kellerman handled the spotting scope, while Hansen maintained the log and monitored their surroundings for signs of German patrols. By 0900 hours, the sun had risen high enough to penetrate the hedge canopy, creating patches of light and shadow across their position. This was both beneficial and dangerous. The dappled light helped conceal them from aerial observation, but it also meant that any reflective surface, a watch crystal, a helmet buckle, a signal mirror could catch the sun and betray their location. Hansen had pulled the mirror from his breast pocket not to signal, but to check his appearance. It was a small vanity, perhaps, but one that many soldiers maintained even in combat zones. The human need to see oneself, to confirm continued existence and recognizable form, persisted even when rational military discipline suggested otherwise. He'd angled the mirror to catch his reflection, saw 3 days of stubble and the hollow-eyed look of insufficient sleep, and was returning it to his pocket when his elbow caught on the edge of the observation post. The mirror tilted, sunlight struck its surface, and for less than 2 seconds, a brilliant flash of reflected light shot across the intervening hedgerows in a direction Hansen hadn't intended and couldn't control. Kellerman saw it instantly. "Jesus Christ, Hansen," he whispered, the words barely audible even at a distance of inches. "Cover that thing." Hansen did, jamming the mirror back into his pocket with hands that had suddenly gone cold despite the June warmth. Both men froze, waiting, listening, knowing that if the flash had been observed, the next sounds they heard might be the last they ever processed. 800 meters to the southeast, in the upper room of what had once been the Beaumont family farmhouse, Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann was lowering his binoculars with an expression that combined satisfaction with something approaching respect. He'd seen the flash, marked its position to within a 50-meter radius, and was already reaching for the field telephone that connected his observation post to the company. Command post 300 meters behind the main defensive line. Hoffmann was 24 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd been transferred to France in March of 1944 as part of the Wehrmacht's effort to reinforce Atlantic defenses before the expected Allied invasion. He'd fought outside Kursk, survived the Soviet counteroffensives of late 1943, and carried with him the particular knowledge that came from warfare against an enemy with superior numbers and increasing material advantage. That knowledge could be summarized simply: small advantages compound, small mistakes kill, and intelligence about enemy positions was worth more than bravery in the assault. The German defensive doctrine in Normandy reflected lessons learned from years of combat on multiple fronts. Unlike the static defense in depth employed in the First World War, Wehrmacht tactical theory in 1944 emphasized flexibility, aggressive patrolling, and the immediate counterattack. When enemy positions were identified, the doctrine called for rapid concentration of force to eliminate the threat before it could report or be reinforced. Hoffmann's call to the company command post was brief and professional. Lieutenant Richter, this is Observation Post 3. American reconnaissance element identified. Grid reference 734-492. Distance 800 meters, northwest of our position. Confirmed by mirror flash at 09:15 hours. Request immediate response. The response came not from Lieutenant Richter but from the company commander, Hauptmann Werner Steiner, who'd been present in the command post reviewing morning reports when Hoffmann's call came through. Steiner was a 32-year-old career officer who'd commanded infantry companies in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood that American reconnaissance elements operated ahead of major formations, that their presence indicated an intention to probe or attack, and that eliminating them before they could report was operationally valuable. Hoffmann, maintain observation. I'm sending a first platoon to sweep the area. Provide corrections as needed. Steiner's voice through the field telephone carried the flat certainty of a man who'd made similar decisions hundreds of times before. First Platoon, 3rd Company, 914th Grenadier Regiment, was at that moment occupying positions in a farm complex 200 meters southeast of Hoffmann's observation post. The platoon numbered 33 men under the command of Lieutenant Otto Richter and represented a microcosm of Wehrmacht infantry in mid-1944, a mix of Eastern Front veterans, recent conscripts, and soldiers recovering from wounds suffered in earlier campaigns. The platoon's equipment reflected Germany's industrial situation by the fourth summer of the war. Most men carried the Karabiner 98K, the standard bolt-action rifle that had served Germany since before the First World War. The platoon's automatic weapons consisted of 2 MG-42 machine guns, arguably the finest light machine guns of the war, capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute. For close support, the platoon had a single Panzer Schreck, the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon developed in response to the Soviet T-34. Within 10 minutes of Hauptmann Steiner's order, Lieutenant Richter had assembled his platoon and begun moving northwest toward the position Hoffmann had identified. The movement was conducted according to standard infantry doctrine. An advance guard of 6 men moved ahead of the main body, with flanking elements protecting the sides and a rear guard ensuring the platoon wasn't surprised from behind. They moved through the hedgerow lanes in a tactical column, weapons ready, each man maintaining visual contact with the soldiers ahead and behind. From their observation post, Hansen and Kellerman couldn't see this movement. The hedgerows blocked line of sight beyond 50 meters in most directions, and the Germans were experienced enough to avoid silhouetting themselves against the skyline or making unnecessary noise. But both Americans knew, with the instinct that comes from training and proximity to danger, that something had changed in the quality of their situation. "We need to move," Kellerman said, his voice still barely above a whisper. Hansen nodded. Standard procedure, when a position might be compromised, was to displace immediately, relocate to a secondary observation point, and continue the mission from a new location. But standard procedure assumed that displacement could be conducted without detection, and both men understood that movement in daylight through terrain offering limited concealment carried its own profound risks. The decision of whether to move or remain in place, whether to trust camouflage or trust mobility, was the kind of tactical problem that had no perfect solution. Stay, and risk being caught in a fixed position if the Germans had indeed spotted the flash and were sending a patrol to investigate. Move, and risk being spotted during displacement, turning a possible compromise into a certain one. Hansen made the decision. We move south, away from the crossroads. Low and slow, 100 meters, then reassess. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Both men began the careful process of extracting themselves from the observation post. They moved with the deliberate slowness that reconnaissance training emphasized, each action controlled and minimal. Kellerman gathered the spotting scope and folded the tripod, careful to avoid any sound of metal on metal. Hansen collected the observation log, secured his equipment, and began the low crawl that would take them out of the position. They'd covered perhaps 20 meters when the first mortar round landed. The German mortar crews had been given Hoffmann's grid coordinates and had adjusted their aim based on his corrections called through the field telephone. The initial barrage consisted of 6 rounds from 2 8-centimeter mortar tubes, a standard suppressive fire mission designed to fix the enemy in place or flush them into the open. The rounds were high explosive, each containing approximately 600 grams of TNT surrounded by a fragmenting steel casing. The explosions transformed the quiet Norman farmland into chaos. Soil and vegetation erupted skyward, the concussive waves rattling through the hedgerows, and fragments of hot metal scythed through the air at velocities that made them lethal at 100 meters. Hansen felt the pressure wave slam against his body, heard the sound arrive a fraction of a second later, and understood with complete clarity that someone had indeed seen his mirror flash and that the response was not going to be subtle. "Run!" Kellerman shouted, abandoning noise discipline in favor of survival. Both men were on their feet, sprinting south along the hedgerow line, trying to put distance between themselves and the impact zone. Behind them, more mortar rounds were landing, the German crews walking their fire across the suspected position with mechanical precision. It was the movement that killed the first platoon. Lieutenant Richter's men were advancing in tactical formation through the hedgerow lanes, approximately 300 meters northeast of Hansen's original position, when the mortar barrage began. The sound of the explosions was clear and close, confirming that the Americans were where Hoffmann had reported. Richter ordered his advance guard to increase pace, intending to catch the enemy while they were disoriented by the barrage. What Richter didn't know, what the German intelligence network in this sector had failed to identify, was that the hedgerow lane his platoon was advancing through was under direct observation by American forces from a position he hadn't anticipated. Specifically, by Captain James Morrison and 1st Platoon, Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 329th Infantry Regiment, who'd established a defensive position in a farm complex 400 meters west of the crossroads 3 hours earlier. Captain Morrison had 28 men under his command, positioned in and around a stone barn that offered both protection and fields of fire covering the approaches from the east. When the German mortar barrage began, Morrison had immediately ordered his men to full alert, knowing that mortar fire usually preceded an infantry assault. When the advance guard of Richter's platoon appeared in the hedgerow lane at a distance of 175 meters, clearly moving toward the sound of the explosions, Morrison made an instant tactical assessment. The Germans were in column formation, focused on an objective to their west, and had not yet detected the American position. Morrison had the advantage of position, preparation, and surprise. The tactical situation was as close to ideal as infantry combat ever provided. "Hold fire until I give the command," Morrison ordered, his voice carrying clearly to the squad leaders, positioned throughout the defensive perimeter. "Let them get closer. I want all of them." The German advance guard reached a point 125 meters from Morrison's position. Behind them, the main body of the platoon was strung out along the hedgerow lane, men spaced at 5-meter intervals, weapons at the ready but oriented toward what they believed was the threat axis. Lieutenant Richter was in the center of the formation, identifiable by the map case slung across his chest and the slightly different cut of his uniform tunic. Morrison waited until the last of the German rear guard came into view, confirming that the entire enemy force was within his kill zone. Then he gave the order that would define the next 30 seconds. Fire! The American position erupted. 28 rifles and 4 Browning automatic rifles opened fire simultaneously, the initial volley timed to hit with maximum surprise and shock. The range was close enough for effective aimed fire, but far enough that the Americans had time to engage multiple targets before the Germans could respond. The effect was devastating. The advance guard died almost instantly, cut down by converging fire before they could process what was happening. The main body of the platoon attempted to return fire, but they were in the worst possible tactical position, strung out in column, unable to maneuver effectively, taking fire from a prepared position they hadn't detected. Men began falling, some killed outright, others wounded, and calling for help that wouldn't come. Lieutenant Richter attempted to organize a response, shouting orders to deploy off the lane and return fire, but the tactical situation permitted no effective response. The tundra, hedgerows that had seemed like protective cover moments before, had become a trap, channeling his men into a killing zone with limited options for escape or maneuver. The engagement lasted approximately 4 minutes. When Morrison finally ordered a ceasefire, the hedgerow lane was silent, except for the sounds of wounded men and the ringing echoes of gunfire fading across the Norman countryside. Of the 33 German soldiers who'd begun the advance, none remained combat effective. 22 were dead, 11 wounded, and the platoon as a military unit had ceased to exist. Hansen and Kellerman had heard the firefight. Even at a distance of nearly half a kilometre, the distinctive sound of concentrated small arms fire was unmistakable. The sharp crack of M1 Garand rifles, the slower, heavier reports of German Kar-98Ks, and underneath it all, the tearing canvas sound of an MG-42 firing in short bursts before falling silent. The engagement lasted perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, then ended with the abruptness that characterized small unit actions where one side achieved tactical dominance. The 2 reconnaissance scouts had continued moving south during the firefight, putting distance between themselves and both the original observation post and the sounds of combat. They'd covered approximately 800 meters before Kellerman finally signaled a halt in a drainage ditch that offered concealment and a moment to assess their situation. "That was Americans firing," Kellerman said, working through the tactical puzzle. "Had to be. That volume of fire, those weapons. But who were they shooting at?" Hansen was staring north, back toward where they'd been, his mind working through a sequence of events that made horrible sense once assembled. The mirror flash, the mortar barrage that came minutes later, the movement of German forces, it had to have been German forces toward their position, and then American fire from a different location, catching those German forces in the open. "It was a patrol," Hansen said slowly. "They saw my flash. They sent a patrol to find us. And they walked right into one of our positions." Kellerman looked at his partner, understanding dawn. "You don't know that. Could have been anything. Could have been a planned ambush. Could have been—" "It was my flash," Hansen interrupted. "I compromised our position. They came looking for us, and they died for it." The 2 men remained in the drainage ditch for another 20 minutes, monitoring their radio for traffic that might clarify the tactical situation. At 1000 hours, they received a coded transmission directing all reconnaissance elements to return to battalion assembly areas for debriefing and redeployment. The push towards St. Lo was being repositioned based on morning intelligence, and scouts were needed for new missions. The return trip took 3 hours of careful movement through terrain that might still conceal German positions. Hansen, Kellerman reached the battalion command post at 1300 hours, physically exhausted and carrying the weight of an engagement they'd heard but not witnessed. The debriefing was conducted by the battalion intelligence officer, a captain who listened to their report with the professional detachment that intelligence work required. "You observed the crossroads for 6 hours," the captain confirmed, checking his notes. "Logged vehicular movement at 0430 and 0615. Identified patrol patterns. Then you received mortar fire at approximately 0920. "Yes, sir," Hansen replied. "We were displaced immediately and continued south until recalled. Did you at any time use your signal mirror or any other equipment that might have compromised your position?" This was the moment. Hansen could have said no, could have omitted the detail of the accidental flash, could have filed a report that made the mortar attack seem like random harassment fire or a lucky German guess. But he'd been raised in a Montana ranching family where dishonesty, even by omission, was considered a character failure more serious than physical cowardice. "Yes, sir. At approximately 0915, I accidentally allowed my signal mirror to catch sunlight. The flash was unintentional and lasted less than 2 seconds, but it could have been observed." The captain's expression didn't change, but he made a note on his report sheet. "Direction of the flash?" "Southeast, sir. Toward German positions." "Understood. Anything else to report?" "We heard significant small arms fire approximately 4 minutes after the mortar barrage, a distance approximately 500 meters northwest of our position." "American weapons, sir, and what sounded like German return fire. The engagement lasted approximately 4 to 5 minutes." The captain nodded, made another note, then dismissed both scouts with instructions to clean their weapons, get hot food, and report back at 1600 hours for their next mission assignment. The debriefing lasted 12 minutes. Hansen left the command post with no idea whether his mirror flash had actually caused the German patrol movement, whether that patrol had run into the American ambush, or whether the entire sequence was coincidence. He learned the truth 3 days later. On the evening of June 30th, Hansen was sitting in a field kitchen area with men from Baker Company when he overheard a conversation between 2 riflemen discussing a recent engagement. One of them, a corporal named Stevens, was describing how their platoon had ambushed a German patrol near a crossroads south of Saint-Lô. 33 of them, Stevens was saying, his voice carrying the mixture of pride and residual adrenaline that characterized soldiers discussing successful actions, came walking right down the lane in column formation like they were on parade. Captain Morrison waited until the whole bunch was in the kill zone, then opened up. "They lost. The whole thing was over in 4 minutes. We lost nobody. They lost everybody." Hansen felt his stomach contract. "When was this?" he asked, interrupting the conversation. Stevens looked at him, slightly annoyed at the intrusion. 3 days ago, morning of the 27th. "Why?" "What time?" "I don't know. Maybe, 9:30. "What's it to you?" Hansen stood up, his mess kit forgotten, and walked away from the field kitchen into the gathering darkness. Behind him, he could hear Stevens asking someone if Hansen was all right, but the words seemed to come from a great distance. He walked for perhaps 200 meters before sitting down against the trunk of an apple tree and trying to process what he'd just learned. The mathematics were simple. His mirror flashes at 0915, the mortar barrage at 0920, the German patrol that had to have been dispatched within minutes of someone spotting that flash, the ambush at 0930 that killed 33 men, cause and effect, action and consequence, separated by 15 minutes and connected by a chain of tactical decisions that would never have occurred without that initial 2-second flash of reflected sunlight. He'd killed 33 men. Or more accurately, his mistake had created the conditions for their deaths. The distinction felt meaningless. Over the following weeks, Hansen continued his reconnaissance duties with mechanical competence. He completed his assigned missions, filed accurate reports, and maintained the professional standards expected of a scout. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of his role and the nature of the war he was fighting. The easy narrative that training had provided Americans as liberators, Germans as the enemy, combat as a morally clear contest between good and evil had been complicated by the reality that his error had killed 33 men who were themselves following orders, moving to eliminate what they perceived as a legitimate military threat, and who died not because of their own failures but because of his. He began keeping detailed notes about the engagement, writing down everything he could remember or learn about what had happened that morning. He discovered that the German unit involved had been 1st Platoon, 3rd Company, 914th Grenadier Regiment. He learned that the platoon commander, Lieutenant Otto Richter, had been 26 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for his actions during the Soviet offensive of 1943. This information came from prisoner interrogation reports that circulated through battalion intelligence channels. Of the 11 German soldiers wounded in the ambush, 7 had survived long enough to receive medical treatment and provide information to American interrogators. Their accounts confirmed what Hansen had already assembled. The platoon had been dispatched to investigate an American reconnaissance element identified by mirror flash, had advanced in good order through what they believed was secure terrain, and had been ambushed by an American force they hadn't detected. One of the wounded Germans, a Gefreiter named Paul Schneider, who'd been with 1st Platoon since its formation in 1943, provided details that made the incident brutally concrete. Schneider described how Lieutenant Richter had received the order to investigate the suspected American position, how the platoon had moved out with confidence because they'd successfully executed similar missions before, and how the first indication that something was wrong came when the advance guard simply disappeared in a storm of American rifle fire. "We never saw them," Schneider told his interrogator, the translation appearing in the intelligence report Hansen eventually read. "We knew there were Americans in the sector, but we thought they were ahead of us, where the mortar fire had been directed. We didn't know there was an entire platoon positioned to our flank. Richter tried to organize a response, but we were in the worst possible position. There was nowhere to go." Hansen read that report multiple times, each reading reinforcing the central truth he was trying to process. Warfare was not the clean, morally unambiguous activity that propaganda suggested. It was a system of cascading consequences, where small actions, a mirror flash, a tactical decision, a moment of inattention could propagate through space and time to create outcomes far beyond the original actor's intention or control. The Army awarded Captain James Morrison a Silver Star for the ambush action, citing his tactical patience and effective use of terrain to achieve overwhelming local superiority. The citation made no mention of how Morrison had known to position his forces at that location, or what had caused the German patrol to move through his kill zone at that particular time. Those details were operationally insignificant. The outcome, 33 enemy casualties for 0 American losses, was what mattered for purposes of awards and after-action reports. Hansen received no award and no official recognition. Reconnaissance scouts rarely did. Their contribution was information, not combat effectiveness, and successful reconnaissance was often measured by what didn't happen, the ambushes avoided, the strong points bypassed, the casualties not taken because intelligence had revealed a better approach. The official record of June 27, 1944, showed Morrison's ambush as a tactical success achieved through good positioning and fire discipline. Hansen's mirror flash appeared nowhere in that record. But Hansen knew. And in the years that followed, that knowledge became the defining event of his war experience, more significant in its psychological impact than the subsequent months of combat that carried him through France, into Germany, and finally, to the war's end in May of 1945. He was involved in dozens of reconnaissance missions between June and May, gathered intelligence that contributed to successful operations, and was twice recommended for commendation by his battalion commander. He performed his duties with skill and courage. But none of it changed the fundamental equation he returned to in quiet moments. 33 men were dead because he'd let a mirror catch the sun. The psychological literature of later decades would develop terminology for what Hansen experienced: survivor guilt, moral injury, the cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously responsible and not responsible for outcomes beyond one's control. But in 1944 and 45, such concepts existed only in the informal wisdom of combat veterans who understood that war created moral complexity that peacetime ethics couldn't address. Hansen spoke about the incident only once during the war itself, in a conversation with a chaplain in March of 1945, 3 months before the German surrender. The chaplain, a Methodist minister from Ohio who'd volunteered for military service after Pearl Harbor, listened to Hansen's account and offered what comfort he could. "You made a mistake?" the chaplain said. "A small one, the kind that happens in combat. You didn't kill those men. The war killed them. The decisions made by leaders on both sides killed them. The system that created the war killed them. You were just a small part of a very large machine." "But if I hadn't flashed that mirror," Hansen began, "if you hadn't flashed that mirror, those 33 men might have lived, or they might have died in a different action the next day, or the next week, or they might have killed American soldiers in a different engagement. You can't know. None of us can know. We do our jobs, we make decisions with incomplete information, and we live with the consequences. That's all anyone can do." The conversation helped, marginally. It provided a framework for thinking about the incident that allowed Hansen to continue functioning, to complete his service, and eventually to return to civilian life. But it didn't eliminate the fundamental question that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Had his mistake been the stupid error that killed 33 men, or had it been the tactical accident that created conditions for an American victory that saved American lives? The question had no answer, because the counterfactual what would have happened without the mirror flash was unknowable. Perhaps the German patrol would have been deployed elsewhere and survived. Perhaps they would have discovered Morrison's position and inflicted casualties on American forces. Perhaps the entire tactical situation would have developed differently, creating a cascade of alternative outcomes that might have been better or worse than what actually occurred. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hansen returned to Montana in September of 1945, part of the massive demobilization that followed Japan's surrender. He went back to ranching, married his high school sweetheart in 1946, and raised 3 children in the same county where his grandfather had homesteaded in the 1890s. He was, by all external measures, a successful man, respected in his community, financially stable, devoted to his family. But he never stopped thinking about June 27, 1944. In 1961, when his eldest daughter was studying World War II in high school, she asked her father about his service. Hansen had never discussed his combat experiences in detail, following the pattern common among many veterans who found that civilian life and military life occupied separate mental compartments that shouldn't be mixed. But his daughter's question created an opening, and Hansen found himself describing the reconnaissance missions, the hedgerow country, and eventually the mirror flash. "Did you ever find out what happened to the German soldiers?" his daughter asked. "They died," Hansen replied. 33 of them, because I was careless for 2 seconds. His daughter, 16 years old and beginning to understand moral complexity, considered this. "But you were fighting a war, right? Against the Nazis? Doesn't that make it different?" "The men who died weren't necessarily Nazis," Hansen said. "They were soldiers, following orders, doing their jobs, like I was doing mine. The difference is that I made a mistake, and they paid for it. But if you hadn't made that mistake, wouldn't they have tried to kill you and your partner? Probably. Then maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was just war." Hansen didn't have a response to that. His daughter's logic was sound, her reasoning clear. But logic and reasoning couldn't eliminate the image he carried in his mind of 33 men walking into an ambush that existed only because he'd let a mirror catch the sun. In 1968, as American involvement in Vietnam escalated and the nation argued about the morality and conduct of warfare, Hansen wrote a letter to the editor of his local newspaper. The letter never mentioned his own service, but it addressed the question of responsibility in combat with an authority that could only come from direct experience. "We ask our young men to go to war," he wrote, "and we expect them to make perfect decisions under impossible conditions. We give them training and equipment and orders. Then we put them in situations where everything they learned might not apply, and every decision might have consequences they can't predict. When they succeed, we call them heroes. When they fail, we call them criminals. But the truth is that war makes everyone both, and we don't get to choose which label applies until long after the fact." The letter generated responses from other veterans, some supportive, some critical. One correspondent, a Marine who'd served in the Pacific, wrote that Hansen's perspective was too forgiving of genuine errors that cost lives. Another, an Army officer who'd been at Omaha Beach, wrote that Hansen's understanding of combat complexity was exactly right, and that more Americans needed to grasp that warfare created moral situations that peacetime ethics couldn't adequately address. Hansen kept both letters, along with the original draft of his own, in a folder he maintained with his service documents and the notes he'd compiled about the June 27th engagement. The folder also contained something else, a photograph of the Normandy American Cemetery, which he'd visited during a trip to France in 1973. The trip had been his wife's idea. She'd suggested that returning to the places where he'd served might provide some kind of resolution or peace. They'd spent 2 weeks in France, visiting battlefields and cemeteries, walking terrain that Hansen had last seen under combat conditions. At the Normandy Cemetery, standing among the 9,000 white crosses marking American graves, Hansen had felt the weight of all the deaths he'd witnessed and contributed to during the war. But it was at a smaller cemetery, a German military cemetery at Lacambe, that Hansen experienced something approaching resolution. The cemetery held more than 21,000 German war dead, their graves marked with dark stone crosses bearing multiple names. The cemetery was quieter than its American counterpart, less visited, and maintained by an organization dedicated to reconciling former enemies rather than celebrating victors. Hansen walked through the rows of graves, reading names and dates, calculating ages, and recognizing that the men buried here had been, for the most part, young men following orders in a war they hadn't started. Some had certainly been convinced by Nazis, true believers in Hitler's ideology. Others had been conscripts, serving because refusal meant death or imprisonment. Most had been somewhere in between, ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but led to outcomes none of them would have chosen. He didn't find Lieutenant Otto Richter's grave. The platoon commander killed in Morrison's ambush might have been buried elsewhere, or his body never recovered, but Hansen spent an hour sitting on a bench near the cemetery's central memorial, thinking about the 33 men whose deaths had begun with his mirror flash. When he returned to Montana, he seemed lighter somehow, as if the trip had allowed him to set down a burden he'd carried for 29 years. His wife asked him if he'd found what he was looking for. "I don't know if I found anything," Hansen replied. "But I think I stopped looking for something that doesn't exist. I wanted to know if what happened that day made me a hero or a fool, but it didn't help me either. It made me a soldier who made a mistake that had consequences. That's all." "That's not a small thing," his wife said. "No," Hansen agreed. "It's not small at all." Robert Hansen died in February of 1998 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Billings Gazette mentioned his World War II service with the 83rd Infantry Division, but provided no details about specific actions or engagements. The funeral was attended by family, friends, and several other World War II veterans who'd known Hansen through the local VFW post. At the funeral, his eldest daughter spoke about her father's character, his dedication to family, and his integrity. She also mentioned, briefly, a conversation they'd had when she was 16 about moral complexity and the difficulty of judging actions taken in extreme circumstances. "My father believed that we're all responsible for our actions," she said. But he also understood that sometimes our actions have consequences we couldn't predict or control. He lived with that knowledge for more than 50 years. It made him thoughtful, careful, and deeply aware of how interconnected we all are. His war didn't end in 1945. It shaped every day of his life afterward. And I think he'd want us to understand that war does that to everyone it touches, on all sides. Among Hansen's effects, his children found the folder he'd maintained about the June 27th engagement. It contained his notes, the intelligence reports he'd collected, the photographs from France, and a letter he'd written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. The letter, dated June 1973, shortly after his return from France, read in part, "I've spent 29 years trying to understand what happened on the morning I let a mirror catch the sun. I wanted to know if I was responsible. If those 33 men died because of my error, and if that made me guilty of something that deserved judgment or punishment, I think I understand now that I've been asking the wrong questions. The right question isn't whether I'm responsible. I am. I made a mistake. The right question is what that responsibility means. It means that I participated in a system war where individual actions have consequences far beyond individual intention. It means that I contributed to deaths I didn't intend and wouldn't have chosen. It means that I carry those deaths with me, not as criminal guilt, but as moral weight. But it also means that the Germans who sent that patrol bear responsibility for putting those men in a position where they could be killed. The officers who started the war bear responsibility for creating the conditions where young men kill each other over hedgerows in France. We all bear responsibility, in different measures, for the system that makes such killing necessary and inevitable. I can't undo what happened. I can't bring back 33 German soldiers who died because I was careless for 2 seconds. All I can do is remember and try to live in a way that acknowledges their deaths as part of my life's accounting, not as a debt I can repay, but as a truth I have to carry." The letter was found by his eldest daughter while sorting through his belongings. She made a copy, which she kept in her own records, and eventually donated the original to the Montana Historical Society, along with other documents related to her father's service. The story of Robert Hansen's mirror flash never became famous. It appeared in no official histories, generated no medals or courts-martial, and influenced no military doctrine or training protocols. In the vast accounting of World War II, a conflict that killed more than 60 million people and involved hundreds of millions more, the deaths of 33 German soldiers in a minor engagement in Normandy barely registered as a statistical footnote. But for Hansen, and for the families of the men who died that morning, it was everything. It was the moment when the abstract concept of war became concrete reality, when ideology encountered material consequence, when the clean narratives of good versus evil became complicated by the messy reality of human error and unintended outcomes. The military lessons of the engagement were straightforward and became part of the institutional knowledge passed through training programs. Reconnaissance scouts were reminded to be constantly aware of reflective surfaces. The importance of securing flanks during movement through close terrain was reinforced. The value of prepared defensive positions and fire discipline was confirmed. These were the lessons that could be codified, taught, and applied in future operations. The human lessons were more complex and less easily transmitted. They involved understanding that responsibility in war is both individual and collective, that intention and outcome often diverge, and that the moral weight of combat decisions cannot be calculated using simple formulas of right and wrong. These lessons lived in the minds of individual soldiers, communicated through conversations and letters rather than field manuals, and shaped how thousands of men understood their own service and its meaning. The German perspective on the engagement, when it can be reconstructed from prisoner statements and post-war accounts, reveals a different set of lessons and consequences. For the survivors of 1st Platoon, the 11 wounded men who lived through the ambush, the engagement represented a failure of intelligence and tactical planning. They'd been sent to investigate an American reconnaissance element, based on a single mirror flash, had moved through terrain without adequate security, and had walked into an ambush that killed 2/3 of their comrades. Several of these survivors were interviewed in later years by military historians researching German defensive operations in Normandy. Their accounts consistently emphasized the shock of encountering American forces, where German intelligence had indicated only scattered reconnaissance elements. One survivor, Gefreiter Paul Schneider, who'd provided detailed information during his initial interrogation, described the psychological impact of the ambush in a 1982 interview. "We thought we were hunting them," Schneider said. "We were confident. We'd conducted successful anti-reconnaissance operations before, but this time we were the ones being hunted. The Americans had been waiting. They'd prepared their position. They had patience. And when they opened fire, there was nothing we could do. It taught me that in war, you're never as smart as you think you are, and the other side is never as foolish as your propaganda suggests." This recognition that the enemy was competent, prepared, and capable of tactical sophistication represented a kind of mirror image to Hansen's own realization. Just as Hansen learned that his errors could create deadly consequences, the German survivors learned that their assumptions about American tactical capability were dangerously wrong. Both sides emerged from the engagement with a more realistic and more disturbing understanding of what warfare actually entailed. The broader strategic context of the engagement was the Battle of the Hedgerows, the grinding attrition warfare that characterized the first 6 weeks of the Normandy campaign. Between June 6 and the end of July 1944, American forces fought a series of small unit actions against German defenses that exploited every tactical advantage the Norman bocage offered. The fighting was slow, costly, and characterized by precisely the kind of close-range engagements that killed 1st Platoon on June 27. The accumulated effect of hundreds of such engagements was the gradual degradation of German defensive capability in Normandy. Each platoon lost, each company reduced to ineffective strength, each battalion withdrawn from the line for rebuilding represented a small but measurable reduction in Wehrmacht combat power. By late July, when American forces finally achieved the breakthrough that became Operation Cobra, the German defensive line in Normandy had been weakened by 6 weeks of attritional combat that included thousands of small actions like the one that killed Lieutenant Richter and his men. In this larger context, Hansen's mirror flash and the resulting engagement were strategically insignificant. The war would have proceeded much as it did regardless of whether 33 German soldiers died on June 27 or survived to die in some other engagement weeks later. The material and industrial superiority of the Allied coalition was such that German defeat was inevitable once the Normandy beachhead was secured. Individual tactical victories or defeats affected the timing and cost of that defeat, but not its ultimate occurrence. Yet this strategic insignificance coexisted with profound personal significance for everyone involved. For Hansen, the engagement defined his war experience and shaped his understanding of moral responsibility. For Captain Morrison, it represented a tactical success that confirmed his competence as a combat leader. For the German survivors, it was a trauma that influenced how they understood their service and their nation's defeat. For the families of the 33 men who died, it was the specific moment when global conflict became personal loss. This tension between strategic insignificance and personal significance characterizes most of what happened in World War II. The vast majority of combat actions were tactically minor, involving small units fighting for local objectives that had no direct impact on strategic outcomes. Yet each of these actions was intensely meaningful for the individuals involved, creating experiences that shaped their lives and the lives of their families for generations afterward. The final accounting of what happened on June 27, 1944, must therefore be done on multiple levels simultaneously. Strategically, it was a minor American tactical victory that contributed marginally to the eventual breakout from Normandy. Operationally, it confirmed the value of reconnaissance, the importance of prepared defensive positions, and the vulnerability of forces moving through restrictive terrain. Tactically, it demonstrated the effectiveness of ambush tactics when properly executed with patience and fire discipline. But personally, humanly, it was something more complex, a moment when multiple chains of cause and effect intersected to produce outcomes that no single participant intended or could control. Hansen's momentary carelessness with a signal mirror. Hoffman's alert observation and immediate reporting. Steiner's decision to send a patrol, rather than just increasing defensive vigilance. Lieutenant Richter's tactical approach to the suspected American position. Captain Morrison's decision to hold fire until the entire German force was in the kill zone. Each decision was reasonable given the information available at the time. Each contributed to an outcome that none of the decision-makers would have chosen if they could have seen the full tactical picture. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the engagement, and the one that Hansen spent 50 years trying to articulate. Warfare creates situations where rational decisions by competent people produce outcomes that, viewed in retrospect, seem avoidable or unjust. The moral clarity that propaganda and patriotism provide before combat becomes complicated by the actual experience of decisions made with incomplete information, producing consequences far beyond original intentions. Hansen's recognition that he bore responsibility for 33 deaths without being criminally guilty of those deaths represented a mature understanding of moral complexity that most civilians never have to develop. He understood that he was part of a system where his actions had deadly consequences, that those consequences included the deaths of men who were themselves part of the same system, and that the proper response was not denial or justification, but acknowledgement and continued moral awareness. This understanding didn't make him a hero in any conventional sense. Heroes, in military mythology, are people who perform extraordinary acts of courage that save lives or achieve tactical victories. Hansen's mirror flash did contribute to a tactical victory, but not through courage or competence through error. Yet the understanding he developed through wrestling with that error perhaps represents a different kind of courage. The willingness to acknowledge complexity rather than retreat into simple narratives of good versus evil. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.